Dan Pontefract is an award-winning author and leadership strategist who helps organizations and leaders improve overall performance. His most recent book of 6 is called The Future of Work is Gray: The Untapped Potential of Age in the Workforce. And if you're watching this on video and you see all my gray, I'm super interested in that topic. He's presented at 4 TED conferences. I always brag that I've spoken at a TEDx and he's done 4 of them, so I'll stop bragging. And over 1,000 keynotes and events. Dan is recognized on the Thinkers 50 Radar, HR Weekly's 100 Most Influential People in HR, and Inc. Magazine's Top 100 Leadership Speakers. Dan, welcome to the show.
Mr. Goldman, thank you for this opportunity. And we're going to come back to your name later on, I hope, because there's a little hidden Easter egg about Goldman and the book. So we'll get there.
All right. Yeah. All right. Looking forward to that. And by the way, speaking of the book, very proud that Dan and I are in a fraternity of Page 2 published authors. That's the name of our publishing company. And that's how we got connected, is we both have the same publisher, and excited about the launch of Dan's book. Depending on when you're listening to this, it might have launched 3 years ago or it might have launched last month, but still excited about the launch. So Dan, as we dive in, name of the show is the Better Leadership Team Show. So I've got to start with, from all of your experience, what do you believe is the most important characteristic of a great leadership team?
What a great question. And to preface it, I have been a leader for about 20 years on teams that range from 50 to 120 global team members. And my real gig, other than books, is working with leaders and leadership teams on how to identify what's working, what's not, the culture, the way in which they get their stuff done, et cetera. And so what I've learned through the 30 plus years of actually doing it, it comes down to one thing. And that is balance. Now, not work-life balance, by the way, but balance. And what's in balance is that any high-performing leadership team has to think about what I call the 4 Ds. And the 4 Ds are as follows. That leadership team has to provide direction. So they must direct. Even if sometimes it doesn't feel right, sometimes you got to tell people what to do. So there's direct, and then you must deliver. If you don't deliver, you're not a leadership team. So those are Ds 1 and 2, direct and deliver. But on the other side of, if you think of a seesaw or teeter-totter, on the other side are the 2 equally important Ds, and they are develop and dignify. When a leadership team is developing each other and the team in which they support, and they dignify the place through sense of belonging, purpose, blooming, if you will, as well, then what you have is balance. But any leadership team that over-indexes on 1, 2, or 3, your seesaw ends up being imbalanced. And what that creates is an underperforming team. And as a leadership team, your job is to make sure that it is high-performing.
Beautiful. And as someone who has written books on how to create a high-performance leadership team, and then my last book was all about how to coach and develop your talent, that's kind of words that dig into my heart in a really good way. So love that. I love that. So it's about balance. So as we, dive in, and I really want to talk about the new book. In that book, you talk about age debt as the workplace equivalent of a climate crisis. What does that mean? And especially for a CEO running a $50 million company, most folks listening to this are kind of senior leaders of mid-market companies. They don't necessarily think about age debt or know what that is. So explain to us what that is and what kind of pain it might cause.
Well, the metaphor of age debt is, first of all, does anyone like being in debt? That's not a fun thing. Credit card debt, mortgage you can't pay, just, you're late on some bills. Debt is not fun. And so if you're a CEO or a senior leader or a leader or HR line leader, it doesn't matter. What I found in the discovery work of this particular book, which was about 2.5 years of research, is that leaders have their heads in the age sand, essentially. And the analogy, is when many of us, we're like, oh, climate change, whatever, it's not a big deal. Except when your house burns down in LA from, a drastic fire, or, for 6 months of the time in British Columbia and Alberta and Canada in the summer, you can't see the sun because the skies fill with smoke. Or anyway, you get the idea. So we didn't really pay attention to climate change. Now we're like, oh, actually, we should do something about this. And we are trying to make up for lost time. So in our organizations, the parable here is we are in debt. And the reason we're in debt are for 4 things we're not really paying attention to. So quickly, demographics, longevity, wisdom, if you call it, come back to that, and then ageism. So those 4 components make up the debt that is age debt. So then a little bit deeper, a little double click for you, Mike. So on demographics, what we're wildly unaware of is that in America, in Canada, in fact, everywhere in the world, the birth rate, the fertility rate has been plummeting since 1970. Now, I'm not pro-natalist. I'm just a math guy. I'm a math minor. And so when the birth rate is below 2.1 in America, it's at 1.6 right now. Even with immigration, that's not enough babies to replace us. And so if the demography is changing from how many babies are we having, clearly our organizations are going to scale older. They're going to have an average older age because there'll be less young people. And it is happening right now. So what happens is we are not planning for a workforce where the average age is increasing. So that's number 1. But then number 2, yay, Mike, we're living longer. So this is good news, isn't it? So instead of like dying in our 50s, we're now living into the 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. Warren Buffett just retired as a 93-year-old, and so did Charlie Munger before that. He was older than Warren. Ariana Huffington's still going. So you just got to say, wait a second. If we're living longer, great. Are we saving enough to live longer? And my argument, and certainly by proof of the data, is that many people in their 50s and 60s don't know they're going to live into their 70s and 80s and 90s, and they don't have enough savings. So ergo, the organization is going to sort of soon wonder, well, if we don't have a lot of young people coming in, maybe we need to rehire some of the older people in order to make up that gap. But we're not prepared for it. Number 3, wisdom. So what's happening is that we keep doing the same thing over and over again. We keep firing people in their 50s and 60s to clear the deck from a P&L perspective because, quote, Mike, they cost more. And if they cost more, then we'll bring in more young people. Okay, well, again, rinse and repeat. We see that happening a lot. But what happens when the wisdom that you fired is not captured? What happens when we used to do it this way, or we don't know who does it that way anymore because we fired them, or the customer relationships with the people, the salespeople, et cetera, that we used to have, but they're gone. We never actually capture what it was like to work with those people, so on and so on. I can give you innumerable examples where actual companies suffered profitability or revenue loss because they have fired the wisdom and not captured it. So that's number 3. And then 4, the last of the isms we still have not solved for is ageism. And ageism is not just for people in their 50s and 60s and 70s. It's actually rampant throughout, where even today, research submitted by BLS and another data point from Bank of America is that there are fewer young people being hired out of college and university than the last 5 years. The numbers are staggering when they moved from about 8% up to 15% of not being able to get hired. And that is astonishing. Like, that's our pure number. So we are using technology, innovations, automations, even AI, of course, right, to ensure that entry-level jobs are being done through automation or AI in many different sectors. Yet where do we get the learnings and the friction and the entry-level sort of doctorate and college degree in the organization, learning how not to do things or how to do things? How did those young people become middle managers? So the ageism is we're not really paying attention to how our hiring practices are for young, middle-aged, or older people. And that in and of itself needs a course correct. So those 4 components, Mike, are all what make up age debt. And I'll tell you with my research that the high proportion of organizations and leaders are not paying attention to it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, when I think ageism, I automatically think of the gray-haired ageism, but what you're talking about is really ageism on both ends of the spectrum now with AI. And, I heard a crazy stat a couple months ago that said for the first time, maybe since the early 1950s, the unemployment rate of college graduates was higher than the unemployment rate of high school graduates.
Yes,
So
that's
it really
precisely
is
it.
on both ends. And the other thing I'll mention, which is, an example, I don't know if it's example of ageism, but it is an example of the value of the gray-haired workforce not necessarily being realized, is a number of years ago, I had a software company that I worked with. And I was working with them as a coach. I was working with them when COVID hit. One of their most senior leaders was, I think he was about a 78-year-old guy who had been with the company for 50 plus years, way longer than anybody else. He was the historian. He knew everything. Sweetheart of a guy.
Yeah.
And he was the guy, while over the years, his responsibility narrowed, not because it was taken away from him, but he wanted his responsibility narrowed. But he was the guy after a meeting, and he was still on the senior leadership team. After a meeting, he was the guy you wanted to walk back to your office with, because he just had so much amazing information that you never knew about the company. And he was also a great coach to the younger people, putting some things in perspective. He had that wisdom that you talk about. And then COVID hit, and they went remote, not hybrid initially, but remote. And the ability to have the conversation with him over lunch or walking to the meeting or walking from the meeting just went away, because everybody's just getting on Zoom calls and then they're gone. And he wound up retiring about 3 months later, partially because he just didn't feel like a valuable part of the organization anymore.
What you're referring to, at least I'll put my inference here on this, the wonderful story, Mike, is one of the other issues we have in the organizations today. And that is, we're not respecting what's called crystallized intelligence. So what's crystallized intelligence? Well, it's your 50-year-old guy there. The individuals who have been at a company for a time like that, 50 years is impressive. But just imagine the tacit knowledge that they've built up. Tacit knowledge being, according to Dr. Polanyi, the invisible wisdom that accumulates and accrues because they've learned how to do it and they almost invisibly know how to do it. They don't need the instruction manual anymore. Like, they just do it. And then when aberrations and hiccups occur, they're able to accommodate and to pivot in ways that people don't understand, because they've crystallized the intelligence of how it's been working and how I might pivot during a time of crisis. So that goes back to my point, where if we don't capture that wisdom, that crystallized intelligence, and when someone walks out the door 3 months after COVID, how did Charlie or Jim or Sandeep or Becky, how did they do that before? Like, does anyone know? And we don't. But the other thing is this, is that if hiring managers, the ATS systems, right, the HR people, the talent recruiters, even just line managers doing the hiring, if they're not rethinking what the talent spectrum is, and they think that they will always be able to replace said older worker with the crystallized intelligence with someone younger and cheaper, better, faster, cheaper, remember that? We've got to rethink the way in which that these people whoever they are, do the hiring, hire. And if we just exit ourselves with all of this crystallized intelligence that has been built up and don't capture it, there's a calamity. I'll give you an example. So in winter 2022, in the south of the US, there was a tremendous and devastating Arctic snowstorm, like a chill that enveloped many of the southern states from Texas to Alabama, et cetera, Arkansas. And just about 200 people died because various electrical grid companies couldn't keep up with the freezing temperatures. And so the power went out in many different jurisdictions. In the after action review that occurred here, what happened with Congress and just sort of what had to happen, because 200 people died, right? They realized a couple things. So first of all, they said, well, yeah, our systems failed and we didn't have redundancy. And so there's a technical point here as well. But they also admitted fault to the fact that They had involuntarily exited so many people with the expertise that could have helped solve the problem when the grids went down. So they admitted fault because of the fact that they had terminated older workers who had the wisdom. But then it gets better. Then in the following year's SEC filing, I won't name the companies, but people might be able to pick up on them. They're in the book. But in the SEC filings, they actually submitted evidence to suggest the following. They said, and in the future, there may or may not be sort of electrical grid malfunctions. And these may be as a result that we don't have the knowledge or the replacement workers. So basically, mea culpa, we understand this now going forward. Just uncanny. So back to your mate and the 50-year-old tenure. I call those individuals Rubies. So what we do in our organizations, we classify them as boomers or silent generation, or me, I'm a Gen Xer. And then you use tropes and memes on these people, right? And we say, oh, hey, boomer, or hey, Dan, you Nirvana grunge-loving Gen Xer, that's unhelpful in the workplace. It might be fun on Threads or Instagram or in your community, but it's not right at talking to you like a people and culture leader, Mike. It's just not right. So when we use those tropes and memes in the organization, we say the oldies or the goldies or, the boomers. What does that do? But when you reflect and say, actually, Mike, you and I, all of us, go through 3 distinct eras in our careers. And this is where I come back to crystallized intelligence. So the 3 eras that I've decided to name them are rivers, rocks, and rubies. And so your friend is a ruby, where there's crystallized intelligence oozing, because on the river era, where this individual learned a bunch of things, made mistakes, very fluid, lots of ideas, but then that fluidity, that river, then drops a few rocks over the mid-career years, meaning there's rocks in your own river because that's where your stoicism comes from. That's where you begin to learn leadership skills. And maybe you're a leader, maybe you're not, but you figured things out. And then between the river and the rock era and learning and more examples where the power goes out, then what you have is your crystallized intelligence fully formed, and now you're a shining ruby like Gandalf and Mother Teresa and Yoda, like all combined into one. Like, don't you want those in your organization? Don't you want those rubies to tap on the shoulder of and say, hey, how'd you do this in 2011? And can we learn from it here in 2026? That's my thoughts.
So I love that. I love that framework of rivers, rocks, and rubies. How should a leadership team actually use that framework day to day? Is it literally, how many rivers do we have? How many rocks? How many rubies? Where do we need more? How do you actually love the framework? How do you execute on a framework like that?
There's a couple of things. And first of all, thanks for the kudos. I think it was pretty clever as well myself. There's a couple of ways. First of all, composition, you're right. So, we should be paying attention to what generational composition we have. Now, I don't mean by generation by those terms. I just mean by age. And if people are like, well, what's a river? Like, what's the age? I don't really care. You're just kind of in that era of maybe it's 16 to 30, 35. The number doesn't matter. Just because I was born in 1971 doesn't mean that I don't have millennial and Gen Z tendencies, because I love Wet Leg and CMAD, these crazy bands that are like 23 years old. So does that mean I'm not allowed to like Wet Leg or CMAD? Like, come on. Anyway. So if like 1830, 1835, and then maybe the rock era is like, I don't know, late 20s, early 30s to whatever, 40, 50. Again, it doesn't matter. It's just this middle block. And then that ruby era is clearly you're not in your 20s, but maybe it's your late 40s, maybe it's 50s, whatever. It's 50 plus. I don't care. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the organization and a leader is saying, yeah, what is the composition of my team? And we've proven through data, through research, through papers, that an intermixed group is more high-performing and productive than one that is not. That's at a board level, that's at a leadership team level, that's at a productivity level, like a team composition. So data tells us that to be high-performing, you should think about your mix. So that's number one. Number two is language. So what's the culture language of your team? So are you using flippant, snippy, weird comments that underrepresent, overrepresent, ridicule make fun of, make inferior of individuals, and that can be old, middle-aged, or young. So, when I hear things like, oh, she's premenopause, like, good Lord, that's a rock woman or a Ruby woman going through something that 53% of women go through. And that in and of itself, again, is sort of an ageist comment, but you're not thinking through that everybody ages and everyone will go through river, rocks, and rubies. So if you're a river and all of a sudden now you're saying, look at that perimenopause woman, she's getting the hot flashes again. How terrible is that? First off, from a culture perspective, but that's not being empathic to the fact that you too, unless you're a male, but you too are going to go through a river, rock, ruby 3-part career era. So it's all these little bits that we got to be rethinking as teams, because like death and taxes, like, we all age, yet we don't talk about it. So when we go to a party, here's another one. So Mike, we go to a party, and what's the number one question that usually gets asked when you meet somebody for the first time? Like, you and I just met, let's say, we're at a
What do you
party, we got a
do?
drink in our hand. What do you do? Exactly. But the second thing that's forming in your head, you never ask it. It's like, oh, I wonder how old he is. All right, so he's a senior director of this. Maybe he's probably 52. I'm going to go with 52. But you don't say that. So I turned 55 in 15 days. I was born in 1971. I think that if you're 28, 58, 88, that we should be more pro-age, because we have created such a antithetical thinking around age. It then enmeshes itself inside of the practices of our workplace, from hiring to succession planning to who gets what gigs to how do we fire people and why and so forth. So back to the hiring managers and the leaders that you mentioned in your teams here, it all needs kind of to be rethought, quite frankly, which is saying something and is an indictment on where we are at with our pro-age prowess right these days.
So I have what may be a jumbled thought in my head. I'll see if it comes out cleaner than it is in my head. But what it makes me think of when I think of specifically the Rubies, and I go back to actually your 4Ds of balance, and the second one I wrote down, which is about delivering,
Yeah.
is, when it comes to somebody's role, when it comes to measuring how productive someone is, when I think back to my friend who was 50 years at this company, 78 years old, his responsibility had narrowed. Certainly, the way to measure the value he was adding to the company was probably very different, or should have been very different than it was 20 years before when he was a senior VP driving a different team. Is there a different way when we go from rivers to rocks and then to rubies? Do we need to think about the value rubies deliver in a different way? Because if we think about it the same way we think about rivers and rocks, it's going to be about productivity metrics. It's going to be about the scope of their responsibility. But with the crystallized intelligence comes that wisdom to actually coach and mentor people and maybe play the historian role of a company. Is there a different way we need to think about performance and productivity for those folks?
I'm a bit of a Star Wars nut, Mike, and I think the metaphor and analogy to use is when Luke Skywalker is told by the hologram of Obi-Wan Kenobi on Hoth to go visit Dagobah. And he ends up on Dagobah, and there's this Kermit the Frog Muppet thing that's sitting in the forest and slime of Dagobah and, trying to steal his lunch. And Luke is a river. He's this brash, naive, know-it-all young punk. And he's told by his mentor, Obi-Wan, right, essentially, to go learn the ways of the Force. So he shows up at Dagobah. He's like, what are you, little squishy green Kermit-like thing? Like, get out of my lunch. And he says, I'm looking for a great warrior, a Jedi, Yoda. Oh, you seek Yoda. You seek Yoda. And this metaphor, really, which I've just come up with now, by the way, because I'm going to see The Mandalorian and Grogu tonight, so maybe that's in the top of my head.
Good movie, by the way. I enjoyed it. I saw it.
And so what you see there is the brilliance of your question. Yoda was a Jedi master, well, is a Jedi master, but was a warrior, fought a lot in the Clone Wars, et cetera, et cetera. And so where am I going with this is that he then goes to Dagobah. Luke has no idea who he is, but he turns out to be the Ruby in a way that's different, banished to this planet on Dagobah. But he then eventually, Luke figures it out and Yoda sort of tries to train him, et cetera, et cetera. Where am I going with this in the real world now? So Yoda was put into sort of a Ruby role on Dagobah to help one kid. Great. Okay. Back in the real world, let's go to BMW. Now, BMW does an age analysis of their organization and realizes that since, basically post or pre-pandemic, like 2018, they started looking at their age demographics and they're like, "Whoa, we are skewing older. What can we do?" Now, Germany is ahead of the curve on the fertility rate plummeting than America. So they said, "Oh, geez, we see this happening. So we're going to plan longer term here." What do? So they have rivers, rocks, and rubies. So they take a look at their rubies and they say, "Okay, we have a program we're going to introduce to you. We call it the Senior Expert Program." The Senior Expert Program is if you are a leader of teams, director, VP, it doesn't really matter, manager, and you would like to relinquish the responsibility to be that leader and still work with us full time, we will call you the Senior Expert. And you will work with that promoted rock into the new role that you held before. You'll be like their Yoda. You'll be their conciliary. You'll be their mentor, their coach. You'll do other things here in the organization, of course, but you'll now move to becoming an individual contributor. And if you just sort of take the Yoda Luke story where Yoda becomes a really true Ruby on Dagobah and then helping Luke, and what real world BMW is doing and saying, "Hey, if you are of this certain age," and I think it's 50 up that they narrowed it to, and they had multiple individuals put their hands up and say, "This is great. I can be the Ruby now to BMW and the team that I supported. Maybe I go to another team and do Ruby-like stuff over there too." But BMW is a real world application of this point where your friend probably was highly respected and the 50 years of wisdom, et cetera, people would go to him all the time about stuff, right? And then he left. So if we're more applied to your question, Mike, on the thinking of what to do with the 50 plus in the golden era, which is the Ruby era, that is something I think we really need to be rethinking as a culture, not just as, line leaders.
Is this, I know you talk about in the book, the experience dividend.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about here? Is that an example of the experience dividend?
It's a micro example of one of the three opportunities, I'll say, that we might be rethinking how we operate our org. So let me just give context to the experience dividend. So actually, Mike, I know you're a music guy. So I wrote the book like an album. And so The Future of Work is Gray is the title of the book. Side A is called Age Debt. And there are 5 tracks, they even call them chapters. So the tracks are those components of age debt we've already explored. You flip the book or the album over and halfway through the book now switches to side B. And side B is called the experience dividend. But this is where I wanted to bring up your last name. So spoiler alert, if anyone's listening or watching, read or listen to the book title changes halfway through the book when you flip the album over. And it's no longer The Future of Work is Gray. The book title is The Future of Work is Gold. So I'm paying homage to you, Goldman. And why? It's because I don't think it's a lost cause where we're at with this age debt. I think it's an opportunity. And so the experience dividend, as you flip to The Future of Work is Gold, which is why the cover of the jacket, the book is gold, by the way. It's another hidden Easter egg, kind of like my Star Wars Easter eggs. The 3 things that make up the experience dividend are pretty simple, and it's as follows: the career canvas, the wisdom wheel, and the longevity lens. What does that mean? Well, double clicking on each of those, the career canvas. I want to set fire, Mike, to every career ladder nomenclature known to organizations writ large. Why are we using a 1920s tactic in the 2020s, i.e. the career ladder? Why is it that we only tell our people, well, the only way in which to get more compensation more pay, more responsibility, more team size, more learning is to go up. It's nonsense. In this day and age, when I talked about all the age debt factors, and back to my BMW example, why not think about talent and thus the career ladder in a different way? So I call it the career canvas. So BMW's example is an example of something that I call slow down. So you might want to slow down as a leader and say, you know what? Can I put my hand up and maybe try something different around here where I don't have to kind of go up, but I can actually go down and not be ridiculed or called demoted? Can I maybe go out of the organization for a couple years? And will you welcome me back? Could I maybe phase out my retirement? So instead of just retiring on Friday and having the cake and the watch, could I maybe phase my retirement out for 3 years and kind of work at 80%, 60%, 50%? These are all career canvas strategies. But what do? We use the 1920s career ladder model and say, no, the only way in which to think about your career is to go up or to be kicked off of it.
Up or out.
Up or out. The wisdom wheel is kind of the bits about your buddy, how we are not capturing that wisdom, but the wisdom wheel suggests ways in which to do that. So how do you create situations where even using AI, I'm not anti-AI, by the way, but using what are called cognitive task analyses, so CTAs, you can use AI to capture videos, capture audio, and then get these nuggets of wisdom. And then you can start articling or librarying them or, basically housing them and turning them into learning nuggets, turning them into what if scenarios, and then feed your LLM with all of this. So you have a walking mentor of your buddy who worked 50 years and all of a sudden now you've got a digital twin of him. Like that's the wisdom wheel thinking. Again, we're not doing. And then thirdly, longevity lens. Because we're living longer, again, yay, what can the organization do to not just prepare people to live longer? So that's number one. But number two is what accommodations can we make in the organization such that older workers can work longer? So spent a couple trips to Japan and South Korea to find out what the Asians are doing. And examples like at Mitsubishi and Toyota on the lines, they've made ergonomic accommodations for older workers in the production of cars and other kind of equipment. And I'm like, that's interesting. And they're doing this because Japan's birth rate is 1.02, by the way. So they're losing tons of people and not having a lot to fulfill or backfill, I should say. So the tech companies, the manufacturing companies, et cetera, they are using AI, virtual reality goggles, ergonomic accommodations on lines, et cetera, so that older workers don't feel the physical stress as much as perhaps they might have when they're in their 20s and 30s. So these are the three components of the experience dividend. And again, there's a ton of different ways in which to rethink age.
When you talk about the career canvas, and if someone is in that slow down mode, does that, I love the idea of being able to do that without this stigma that you were demoted. But when someone does that, should that come with a salary decrease because they've got less responsibility? Or is realizing the value they add as Rubies, although it's different, there's value there, is salary adjustment not really part of the equation?
Well, in BMW's case, it's not. They want to make sure that individual is remunerated according to their talent. And just because they may not be leading a team anymore, they've decided as an organization that it is tit for tat. I don't know if that's the case for all organizations from a financial perspective. What I just ask is that people take a look at that and say, well, how might we offer this? So instead of finance people and line leaders huddling in a conference room and saying, okay, well, we've got to make some budget cuts here. So, well, Johnny is 120K and Sally's 180K. And well, Jimmy over there is 50 and we can hire someone else for 50. So we can save 200 grand by getting rid of 60 years of experience and replacing that with, well, carry the 8. Is that the logic? It's just like, oh, we're trying to save 200 grand, yet not thinking through what the soft costs will be downstream when you have an Arctic storm blast. So you have to be thinking this way, I believe, to protect whatever business you're in from future calamity. And I call it pre-mortem. So you're kind of like using wisdom in your pre-mortem kind of forecasting and projections, saying, well, how do we hedge? Now, again, it's smart to be just in case thinking, but at the same time, like back to my Yoda Luke thing, you do have opportunities to repurpose these people in different ways. They have, Mike, as you know all too well, transferable skills from all the different things that they might have done in that org and their tenure. So wouldn't you want that happening so that your continuity of business work and almost like a governance aspect to protecting where you want to go and your line revenues, your customer sat, all the VSATs, et cetera, that to me just wildly is not thought of as a good practice. It's thought of as, Dan, you're crazy. Why would we do that? We're running a P&L here.
So the question that bubbles up for me as we're talking, and I'm going to take a few of the things we talked about and pull them together. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, the AI impact of not hiring the young, the ageism on the other side, not hiring the younger people, but then, how do those folks become, rocks and rubies if we're not hiring? So think about the AI side, and you talk about the wisdom wheel.
Yeah.
So when I think about AI and the wisdom wheel, is there an argument that says, hey, what we could do, what we should do? You mentioned digital twin. So let's take all these rubies that are starting to get kind of on in years, and they're kind of, maybe they're ready to slow down, or they're costing us too much money at this point, to your point. Can we encapsulate all of their knowledge into an AI? I've got an AI called Ask Mike that my clients use that have my books in it, my my solo podcast and all this stuff. Can we take all this great knowledge and put it into a digital twin Yoda where we could fire Yoda or force Yoda to retire because we've got the digital twin of Yoda, which would have made for a really bad movie if that's what they did. But help me figure that out, because I could see someone taking the idea of AI and where it is and where it's going to use that as a reason why, hey, maybe we don't need these gray-haired folks anymore once we create their digital twin.
So one of the things that humans provide that AI hopefully never does in terms of sentience is context with emotion. Like, AI doesn't feel. And when you feel, you can provide an additional context that an AI cannot. So there is infinite amount of wisdom that people have that an AI can capture. The how-tos, the tacit knowledge, as we talked about, right? Other components of tricks up my sleeve and how to work with this client, or what happens when the line goes down, or if there's a fire in the plant out in the middle of the forest. That's just stuff that you can definitely capture. But without emotion and understanding empathy and compassion and sympathy and the context that's rooted in our humanity, I mean, that's kind of the point. So if you flip, again, I don't know why I'm doing this, but here we go. But if you one more movie ahead from The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke meets Yoda on Dagobah, he comes back 3 years later, Return of the Jedi, and Yoda is a dying creature, right? He's a dying Jedi Master, and Luke senses this, and now Luke is essentially a Jedi. But Luke has gained into this, now I would call him a rock, so he went from river to rock, and his Ruby mentor is dying. You feel Luke's empathy in the context, right, of what Yoda is going through and how Yoda's patience and teaching through the two movies basically got him to where he is. AI is never going to be able, I hope, Mike, to be able to provide that empathy and context in situational awareness. And that, to me, is where the humans have to rise. So I have this other equation I use in some of my work with leadership teams, and it is as follows. It's OI plus AI equals EI. OI is original intelligence. AI is obviously artificial, but equals EI is enhanced intelligence. I'm a big fan of AI, but I'm a bigger fan of humans. And it's the order of those operations that matter. We have to start with original intelligence, which includes emotional intelligence, by the way. And if we start there and then say, well, how might we complementarily enhance our own collective intelligence and wisdom, then we have the right math. If, however, Mike, the bean counters and the senior leaders are doing what we know is happening, which is flipping the order of the operations around and saying, okay, how many less young people can we hire because we can replace the entry-level task roles, jobs, etc., with AI? That is AI minus OI equals a disenhanced intelligence. And that's, to me, I think, really a philosophical question of leadership.
Yeah, and if we're disadvantaging the young folks and not hiring them, we're not planting the seeds of future OI pairing with AI. So I love that way of
Exactly.
thinking. When we think about the experience dividend, what's, for the senior leader listening, what's this single highest leverage action they can take? I imagine, and I dealing with mid-market leaders every day, and I know most are not thinking about much of this at all.
Yep.
So if I'm right and folks are saying, holy crap, this is something I need to think more about and maybe actually do something about, what's the single highest leverage action a senior leader can take like now to start going down the road of experiencing that experience dividend?
Well, the key thing here is that, to your point, they're not thinking about this. Even before all of that, they're not thinking about one of the biggest age debt components, which is the demographic apocalypse. The maths, like no one is going to be able to outmath this. There will be fewer young people, even with immigration, and we know what's happened in both US and Canada with immigration levels. We've capped them and diminished them. So regardless, even with immigration, those immigrants are coming with either 0 babies or 1. So it's just math. And as your organization will have fewer young people and the average age will continue to increase over the next coming decade, I think there's two things: the responsibility for you to become more pro-age and just understand the math, which then leads to the more tactical piece is back to our wisdom conversation. So what is your strategy to capture the ways in which that we do things, the stories, the mechanics, all that stuff? And then how do you share that? And how do you continue to replenish that? Because businesses continue to learn and do new things. But if you have an anti-age practice where you're not thinking about age in this demographic apocalyptic way, and you just assume that, you know what, the 1970s model of, people, we have more young people, fewer middle-aged people, and less older people, it's going to continue because you're not thinking through the math. You're going to wind up in trouble, I assure you. And the more winter storm Elliots that I talked about in 2022, the more Boeing issues that we didn't even surface, which has to do, by the way, with getting rid of a lot of older workers in those plants, that is going to continue to pop up in industry after industry.
As we wrap things up, Dan, talk a little bit more about what you do. Obviously, you get out there, you do a lot of speaking, you've got your 6 books, but what does your business look like? How do you help clients and who do you help?
You know the game Trivial Pursuit, Mike? And when you play Trivial Pursuit and you've got that little pie piece and you kind of collect the 6 colors of the pie to make up like a pizza pie, essentially, of 6 nuggets of wisdom, I hope. That's me. I do 6 things and I interchange them. And I, having left the full-time world of being a chief envisioner and before that a chief learning officer for 8 years, I've been a Trivial Pursuit pie piece, essentially. So as you mentioned, one of them is writing books. Another one is doing keynotes. Another one is doing workshops for clients. Could be half day, mix it up. Another one is what I call substantive consulting. So that could be people and culture type work, like leadership models, working with the board, whatever the case may be. The 5th is retainers. So I'm kind of like on call or working with teams on a variety of matters. Just it could be people on culture, business related, whatever. And the six, it's kind of related to writing, but I leave it as separate, and that's research. My job is to make sure that I am in tune with what's actually happening. So I conduct interviews, just a voracious reader. Using AI as well has been very helpful. Those six pieces kind of make up my day to day and my week to week.
And if someone wants to find out more about you and any of those six different pieces, where's the best place for them to go?
My name's pretty easy, danpontefract.com. And, or if you want, directly go to the same place, the book, The Future of Work is gray.com. And you know what, Mike? You can spell gray however you wish. Could be the Canadian way or the American way. I am friendly for both sides of the 49th border.
And I won't call it the right way or the wrong way. We could leave it as beautiful. Well, hey, this was great. I always say, if you want a great company, you need a great leadership team. I think, Dan, you covered some ways of thinking about that I haven't thought about and most haven't thought about. So love it. Thanks so much for helping us get there today, helping us all create better leadership teams. This is great.
Well, you put the gold in the future of work as gold, Mike. So thank you for you.
Love it.